figure this out. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to introduce to you our speaker who will be speaking to us on behalf of the Green Mountain Audubon Society. I am very excited to be able to bring to you yet another young scientist who has just recently graduated from UVM and is now in her first stages of her career. She was an Audubon Vermont intern. She's a former UVM student. And as we were chatting before you arrived, she has lined up a really exciting position for the upcoming summer. So she was on Palmyra, which is the focus of her talk, and we're going to learn about the 7 extirpated species of seabirds and the bird surveying, invasive plant control, and plant monitoring. And she scared the bejesus out of me before you got here talking about spiders that are as big as your hand. I don't know if I need to know any more about that. Okay, so I now introduce to you our speaker for tonight, Claire Reilly. Claire, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Claire, and I'm so excited to share my experience doing seabird conservation on Palmyra Atoll during my time as a conservation science volunteer with the Nature Conservancy. So, before we get into the work, just a little bit about me. I'm originally from Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and like Tom just mentioned, I recently graduated from UVM. I studied environmental science and wildlife and fisheries biology. I am a birder, and wasn't until I went to UVM that I realized that you can actually make a career out of that as well. So now I am pursuing a career in avian conservation. And one of the first things that got my foot in the door doing that was actually being a technician on UVM's bird-friendly maple research project. I was able to be a technician during my undergrad. And for those who are not familiar, the Bird Friendly Maple Project is a collaborative Vermont conservation project that incentivizes sugar bush owners to maintain biodiversity for the sake of the birds, as opposed to just having a sugar maple monoculture. So I was able to work as a arthropod technician, which came very in handy on Palmyra, which I'll get into later. And also this past summer, I was on the field crew. And then this past summer as well, I was also able to be Audubon Vermont's priority species conservation intern. And during that internship, I was able to help out with conservation efforts for not invasive, two endangered Vermont birds, the common tern and the golden winged warbler. I also was able to help out with the MAPS bird banding station at Audubon, which was an amazing experience. But it was actually working with the terns that kind of sparked my interest in seabirds and working with coastal species, and is ultimately what led me to accept the position on Palmyra.
Claire, I'm going to butt in for just a minute and let everybody know that the way we do our questions, because Claire's presentation tonight is in 3 sections, and she will be taking questions after each of the sections finishes. And you can ask the questions by simply opening up the chat, which is on the bottom of your screen, and then type your question, and I will see the question and I will relay it to her. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, a bit about Palmyra. Palmyra is one of the U.S. minor outlying territories. It is also the northernmost atoll in the Line Islands archipelago, which is 1,000 miles south of Hawaii. And I included this map down here for scale, because Palmyra is truly in the middle of the ocean. And what's amazing about Palmyra is that most of it is a national wildlife refuge, and that extends not only to the islands themselves, but also the surrounding reef. The 6 miles out of the reef are protected. And in addition to that, Palmyra is part of the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Wildlife Monument, which was created in 2009, and it's one of the largest areas of marine protected ecosystem in the world. And so that protects, in addition to the wildlife refuge status, up to 50 miles around the atoll. So the dual levels of conservation there make Palmyra an incredibly important refuge for all types of species, from terrestrial to reef to pelagic. And another reason why Palmyra is so special and unique is because it's one of the largest remaining Pisonia grandis forests in the world. So Pisonia grandis is a tree that is indigenous to the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and it is only found on low-lying coral islands. And because of that, like highly specific habitat, it's already very limited to where it can exist. And a lot of those islands where it can exist are occupied by humans. So Palmyra is not occupied by humans like in any permanent sense. And so the Pisonia grandis forest is able to persist. And Pisonia grandis is an incredibly important tree for forest nesting seabirds. And as a result, Palmyra is the second largest red-footed booby colony in the world, second only to the Galapagos. So, a little bit about the history of Palmyra. Palmyra was first documented in 1806, I believe. It was by a US ship called the Palmyra, which is where it got its name. But it wasn't like claimed until later that century, where it was claimed under private ownership as part of the Kingdom of Hawaii, and as such was annexed to the United States later that century. And during this period, while it was privately owned, there were several attempts to make Palmyra a coconut plantation. And each time that was attempted, it was abandoned because, as you might guess, it is quite expensive and difficult to transport things to and from Palmyra. Um, so that those were all abandoned attempts. And then in the 1940s, during World War II, Palmyra became a US Navy base, and there were around 6,000 people stationed on Palmyra, which doesn't sound like that much, but Palmyra is only about 5 miles long. So I imagine it was quite crowded. And during this time, they made massive ecological changes to the atoll in order to make it more habitable. They dredged the lagoon, they connected islets, they built causeways so they could drive around. They dug the channel out of the reef, and they built the runway, which actually is the same runway that we still use to get on and off of Palmyra. And it's one of the last remaining coral rubble um, runways, for better or for worse. And during this time, they also accidentally introduced black rats and two species of mosquito to Palmyra. And then after the war, the naval base was abandoned. It just remained under private ownership until those private owners sold it to the Nature Conservancy in 2000. And then the following year, TNC sold most of the atoll to Fish and Wildlife for the creation of a national wildlife refuge, with the exception of Cooper, the main island with the field station, and a few islands that have potentially unexploded ordnances left over from the war. So here is kind of a visual representation of all the changes that were made to Palmyra during the Navy occupation. The biggest one being that there were originally 3 lagoons separated by mudflats, and they dredged that, used the substrate to build up the islands. They basically like manufactured this entire island. This is Cooper. And they connected all the islands. They made these causeways to drive. Here's a channel over here that they dug out of the lagoon. So they really just changed the entire makeup of the island. And then this is what Palmyra looks like today. So as you can see, a lot of these changes made during the war are still persisting, but there are lots of places where the water is starting to break through the islands again, and this natural, like disconnected island atoll system is being restored. And I just took this from Google Earth, so I'm not exactly sure what year this is from, but during my 6 months while I was there, this island over here, Eastern Island, actually broke through right here. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service are in the process of naming this new island that was just created, which is super cool. So some of the ecological legacies of Palmyra's history. So one of the biggest, most important ones is the introduction of the invasive coconut palm. That was during the coconut plantation attempts that failed. The coconut palms, they're not inherently bad on island ecosystems. They actually can be really helpful for preventing erosion along the shore. But when they um, are present in like a monoculture, they tend to take over, outcompete native vegetation, and just gravitate towards becoming a monoculture. And so that's a current issue on Palmyra. They're outcompeting a lot of the native trees, including Pisonia grandis. Another important ecological legacy to mention is the introduction of the rat and mosquito and the impacts of that. So the rats on Palmyra were really a big deal. They decimated the seabird populations, both um, forest forest nesting in the trees and on the ground. And it was during this time that it's actually believed that the extirpated species were extirpated because they nested on the ground and the rats were just heavily predating on the chicks. Another thing that rats did to the ecosystem was they really feasted heavily on the understory of the forest, and they were suppressing the native vegetation. And so when rats were eradicated in 2011, and it's actually a very cool way that the rats were eradicated. So it took a few attempts because the rats were actually hanging out in the crowns of the coconut palms, which is a terrifying thought, but also just very unexpected. And so the reason it took a few attempts is because they were originally only baiting the ground with rodenticide, and the rats were spending most of their time in the tree. So TNC scientists had to develop this novel approach where they were baiting the ground to the canopy, and it took about 3 months of intensive baiting in order to get rid of the rats. And there's a lot of really interesting scientific literature about that now too. And that technique is being replicated on other island ecosystems that are facing similar problems. But anyways, an unintended consequence of eradicating the rats was that all that understory space that the rats had created by eating all the saplings was, instead of being taken up by native vegetation, it was taken over by the faster growing coconut palms. So we saw an increase of coconut palms after the rats were eradicated. But there also was a positive side effect of the rat eradication. The one species of mosquito, the Asian tiger mosquito, was subsisting pretty much only on rats. And so when the rats were eradicated, that mosquito disappeared. And that was unintentional, but kind of relieved some of the pressure on the seabirds. So that was great. And then another lasting legacy that I just pointed out with the last slide too was all of the changes to the geomorphology. So atoll systems are very fluid in nature. There's water flowing in and out, nutrients flowing in and out. And all of that was cut off when the Navy connected the islands and closed it off to the ocean. And in addition to that, they were also pumping their raw sewage into the lagoon, which why you would pump your sewage into the lagoon when the open ocean is on the other side of the island, I will never understand. But they were doing that and they were putting a lot of other like waste into the lagoon. And because they had closed it off, they basically kind of choked the life out of the lagoons. But over time, nature is trying to reclaim the atoll. Water is breaking through the islands again, and flow is being restored. And the lagoon is coming back to life. There's coral trying to recruit in there right now. There's fish, manta rays, sharks. So hope is not lost for Palmyra's lagoons. But that leads us to where we are today. So to address all of those conservation issues, TNC kind of unified under one branch, which they called CARL, the Climate Adaptation Resilience Laboratory. And this was developed in 2019. And they developed this kind of three-pronged approach where they have island conservation, coral reef resilience, and pelagic conservation. And while those ecosystems might seem quite different, they are actually inextricably linked on Palmyra. And I borrowed this slide from TNC because the visual is really helpful. So it starts out here on the pelagic ecosystem with the seabirds foraging on fish, and then they fly back to Palmyra where they roost or nest, and they poop, and they deposit those nutrients that they derive from the ocean into the soil where it supports the forest. And then when it rains, that guano and nutrients gets washed into the reef where it supports the zooplankton communities, which the planktons are kind of the backbone of coral reef and just marine food chains in general. So that guano then supports a healthy reef, and then the pelagic species come into the reef to feed. And that nutrients that fish who have been feeding on plankton have acquired goes back out into the ocean, and the process repeats. So each one of these ecosystems needs the other to survive and be healthy. And so my position as a conservation science volunteer, excuse me, was mostly focusing on the island conservation aspect, but I did get to dabble a bit in both. So one of the largest projects, well, I guess I'll pause for questions if there's any at this point before I start talking about the actual work.
I think everybody is just looking at the palm trees and not looking at the window glare. We have no questions at the moment, so you can continue.
Okay, great. So one of the largest projects happening right now under the island conservation umbrella is Palmyra Atoll Rainforest and Reef Realignment Project, or PARP for short. PARP is basically exactly what it sounds like. We're trying to move Palmyra away from this coconut palm monoculture and back to what a healthy Pacific rainforest looks like. So the two species of trees are really important here that are the Pisonia grandis and the Heliotropium fourthoranium. These two species of tree are preferred by forest nesting seabirds, which is why they're identified as like conservation priority. And as I just explained, the seabird presence on Palmyra supports not only the forest, but also the reef and the pelagic ecosystem from their guano. So seabird presence on Palmyra is absolutely necessary to maintain that land-to-sea connection. But the introduced coconut palms are outcompeting native trees, and they are not preferred and not utilized by seabirds. So, one of the goals of PARP is to eliminate 95% of coconut palms in order to maximize the amount of available roosting and nesting habitat for seabirds. And that's a pretty ambitious goal, but since the project started in 2019, 1.3 million coconuts have already been removed. And so PARP has kind of three phases. The first phase being rat eradication, which is complete, happened in 2011. And now we are currently in the rainforest realignment and the restoration of native seabird phase. So here's just kind of a visual of the difference between non-native and native forest. And this is really interesting because this is actually the same island. This is the coast of the same island. This half of it, or this side of it, has not been, the coconut palms have not been removed, and they have on this side. And you can see the difference in the non-native forest. The overstory is dominated by coconut palms. There's a little bit of, these are heliotropium trees. They're present along the shore, but they're quite small because they're being suppressed by the palms. And then in the absence of the palms, in the native forest, the canopy is dominated by these big, fluffy heliotropium trees. And we have much happier looking helio and a couple of other native species sprinkled in there as well. So that's just kind of like, so you guys can visualize what a native versus non-native forest looks like. So how do we actually remove the coconuts? So what you're looking at here is a before and after of a plot that has been, the coconuts have been removed from. And if you hear me referencing plots, we kind of chop the atoll up into plots so that we can have like a rotating schedule of when they need to get treated in order to maintain the momentum with the project. So um, the left is the before, the right is after. And what you're looking at here is what we call toothpicks. Basically, the adult palms get injected with herbicide at the base, and then over the course of a few weeks or months, they lose all their fronds and the tree dies. Um, and so that's what kind of gives it the toothpick appearance. And that's what we do for the adult trees, but we have a different approach for the juvenile trees, which we call hack and splash. So for this one, we don these very, oops, I went too far. We would don these very fashionable cotton coveralls, which are just lovely to wear in the 90-degree full humidity tropical weather. And we go into the forest, and this on the right here is kind of like a visual of the size trees that we go after with this hack and splash technique. And basically, you have your machete in one hand and your herbicide spray ball in the other, and you go out and you hack the tree and you splash it with herbicide and you repeat. And it's honestly quite fun, but it's very effective for removing the juvenile palms. And we also have the intermediate stage palms can be sawed with hand saws, but once they get this kind of like barky appearance with like these two adult trees, that's when we would pivot to the drill and fill and inject them at the base. And so the combination of those is what we use to clear the plots of coconuts. And we have to go back 2 to 3, maybe even more times, and do that over and over before the plot is actually coconut free. So it's a very intensive process. But this picture is also really helpful for visualizing what the understory of a coconut palm dominated forest looks like as well. I know I just showed the overstory, but you can see just how dense it is in there. Like it's impossible to walk. There's no airflow, which really negatively impacts the microclimate. There's a lot more invasive arthropods in the coconut compared to the native forest. And I actually saw a lot of seabirds die from getting tangled up in the palm fronds and not being able to free themselves. So aside from just the nesting aspect, there's a lot of negative impacts of this coconut palm dominated forest.
Claire, we have a question about the herbicides,
Oh, sure.
and I thought it would be a okay time to ask that. So, one of our attendees has said, "What is the impact of the herbicide on the island's ecosystem, and what is that herbicide made from?"
Okay, yeah. So great question. We use Roundup or glyphosate, and we use a very, very weak percentage. It's only 8% for the hack and splash. And um, have we have blue food coloring that we put into the dye so that we can see exactly where it's going, and it gets applied directly to the stump of the coconut that we have just hacked. And we also take a couple of different precautions so that it doesn't run off into the environment. We don't do hack and swash if there is any type of rain before or after, so that the herbicide can't get washed off of the stump. And the spray bottle technique is so that we can just very like acutely target the stump without having like any spillage into the environment. So it has a very minimal effect, and it is also such a weak concentration that it's not too dangerous if it would wash away. Um, but I'm not exactly sure if there has been any like I'm no, I'm sure it has been confirmed that there was not too many negative impacts to outweigh the positive, because the problem with coconut palms is that they resprout if you chop them, if you just chop them. So the treatment with herbicide is necessary to kill it, unfortunately. But we do take a lot of precautions to make sure that it doesn't affect the surrounding environment too much.
Well, the questions are sprouting like some of those coconut palms, so you have a second one. How does the native forest grow back after the coconut palms are removed? And do native trees need to be replanted?
Great question. And that is also a great segue into my next slide. So,
I
this,
paid this person to ask that question at this particular point, Claire. Thank you.
oh, okay, sure. Um, well, so the answer is yes and no. We do a little bit of active replanting of the native forest once the coconuts have been removed. But in general, we've found that in a lot of places, we don't need to do any additional outplanting in order to see the native forest regenerate. They just need the access to nutrients and sunlight that the coconuts were taking away in order for them to spring back to life. But we do a little bit of outplanting as well, just to kind of supplement that regeneration. Okay, well, I'm going to move on if there are no more questions.
Move on.
Okay, so like I was just talking about, the step after removing the coconuts is the native forest regeneration. So these two photos are from a project that I actually helped finish while I was down on Palmyra. And we call it photo points, but basically we just return to the same spot where coconuts have been cleared from a plot, and we take a photo every 6 months so that we can document how the native forest is regenerating. And in some places, the coconut palms do return, and we have to go back and hit them again, get rid of them. But in other places, like this one, we see that the native plants are just able to recover on their own. So this one on the left was taken in June 2021, right after the plot was cleared. And I took this photo on the right in December, so 2.5 years later. And in just 2.5 years, these trees, which were babies over here, are already taller than me. So it's really amazing how fast these plants are able to recover once they are just given the chance to do so. So another goal of PARP is to attract back the extirpated species, and we are doing that with a Seabird social attraction project. So this little photo over here is kind of just a guide to the seabirds of Palmyra. We have the resident species up top and the extirpated species down below, which we are trying to attract back. And we are doing that with decoy colonies and seabird collar systems. So the decoy colonies are the birds we're trying to target with the decoy colonies are the blue-gray noddy and the gray-backed tern. And the reason we're doing that is because colony nesting seabirds are drawn in by each other's presence. They take each other's presence as an indication of suitable nesting habitat. And so they're more likely to come and investigate a potential nesting site if they see others of their own species. And so we've had 6 decoy colonies, 3 of each species in place since 2021. And then in addition to the decoy colonies, we have seabird collar systems. So these are more geared towards the petrels and the shearwaters, and they are basically broadcasting the calls of the extirpated species out to sea 24/7, day and night. So there are 2 of them that have existed since 2021, and they were put out in conjunction with the decoy colonies. But in 2023, TNC got a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to target two endangered seabirds, the Polynesian storm petrel and the Phoenix petrel. And with that, they were able to create four new seabird collars to target those species. So this is what a seabird collar system looks like over here. We have a pelican case with kind of like the internal housing, the wiring, and then there's two speakers per collar, and all that is hooked up to a solar panel, which powers the whole thing. And then we have three game cameras situated by each seabird collar so that we can keep an eye on any bird activity that the collars might be drawing in. And we have artificial burrows down here to encourage our burrowing nesting species to nest if they so desire. And this was a large portion of my responsibility as a conservation science volunteer because these were all put out right before I arrived. I think the last one was finished in August of 2023. And I arrived at the end of that month. So we spent a lot of time monitoring the game camera footage, making sure these were functioning. And unfortunately, about 2 months into my term, all four of them broke to varying degrees. And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the problem was. And eventually we realized that the wires had corroded in just less than 6 months of being out on Palmyra. That's how like intense the environment is out there. And we had to replace all of the wiring. Up here in the right-hand corner is me soldering a wire, which is not a skill I expected to gain from doing seabird conservation work, but it was cool nonetheless. And we actually got all four of them up and running again before I left, which was really gratifying. And one of the most exciting parts of this project is that it is working. So in 2023, there was a pair of grayback terns that nested on Barren Island. Barren is a coral rubble island. It's on the very far east side of the atoll. And this is their chick right here. It was very closely monitored and it fledged and flew off, which was so exciting. And actually, while I was on Palmyra, it was, I think, 2 days before I left, I was out on Barren Island and I saw me and the person I was with, we saw three more grayback terns. So they have come back. It's about the same time as when they nested last year. So we're really hoping that they choose to nest here again. And then also we had a Christmas shearwater nest on one of the islets in the Eastern Lagoon. I think that was at the end of 2022. So in addition to these nesting events, we also have just been seeing the extirpated species out and about on Palmyra. Just within 6 months that I was there, I saw bulrus petrel, Christmas shearwater, wedge-tailed shearwater, tropical shearwater, and blue-gray noddy. And some of those were spotted offshore, but some of them were spotted right from like standing on the island. So we know they're around. It's possible that some of them are already nesting on Palmyra, but it's just impossible to like search the whole atoll all the time. So hopefully we have some more instances of nesting in the future to report. Okay, any questions about seabird social attraction before I move on?
You are stunning us all with all this fabulous information. So lead on.
Okay, great. So in addition to yeah, shifting away from PARP, in addition to all of the active seabird recruitment projects that we have, there also are many seabird monitoring jobs that we did that just contribute to very long-term data sets. So I'm gonna just highlight a couple of them, not really comprehensive, but some of the fun and exciting ones we worked on. One of them being acoustic monitoring. This project has been in place for a couple of years now, and it's a passive monitoring technique using audio recording devices that are called sound meters. They record 1 minute out of every 10, just continually. And they're used to help estimate total seabird abundance on Palmyra and also to understand how seabirds are using native versus non-native forest, which is really interesting. And then also under current NIFWF funding, they're being used to detect the two target species, the Phoenix petrel and the Polynesian storm petrel. There are 15 of these devices situated around Palmyra, and they're serviced every quarter. So I got to do this twice. We travel to all of them all around the atoll, and we collect the data, update them, just make sure they're set and ready to keep recording. And not a lot of people get to go to every single island on Palmyra, so that was a really awesome project to be involved in. We also do regular shorebird surveying because Palmyra is not only a stopover site, but it's also overwintering site for several species of shorebirds. So we conduct these surveys every week. We do them on the runway at high tide, with the idea there being that the high tide pushes the birds off the shore and onto the runway where we can more easily count them in a centralized location. And then the common species that we have are Pacific golden plover, bristle-thighed curlew. Those two are definitely the most abundant, but we also have um, wandering tattlers, ruddy turnstones, and sanderlings. And this is just a quick little graph to kind of highlight the monthly averages of the two most popular shorebirds on Palmyra during my 6 months. And it's kind of exactly what you would expect. It's highest during fall migration, kind of dropped down during the winter, and then picked back up leading up to spring migration. So also during these surveys, we saw a lot of vagrants, especially during migration, which was really important data to collect to understand which species are utilizing Palmyra. And to my surprise, I saw a lot of species that are familiar to me, like the lesser yellow legs, blue-winged teal. And some of these species were the first ever to be reported on Palmyra, which is pretty exciting. I don't think that sharp-tailed sandpiper or American kestrels have ever been seen on Palmyra before. And yeah, it was just exciting for me as an East Coaster to see these birds that are familiar to me out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So yeah, that was cool. And then another regular seabird monitoring activity that we did was called mean incubation counts. These are actually a U.S. Fish and Wildlife led project, but the science volunteers get to help out. We do these, there are 5 plots that we survey every 45 days, which is the approximate incubation period for a red-footed booby. And we basically just count all of the active nests and all of the chicks for every seabird species we see. And the chicks get assigned an age class so that we can track them and see if they make it to adulthood and fledge and fly away. And that data is used to just track nesting patterns over time and see if there are any changes, irregularities, or patterns that can be identified. For example, and this is purely anecdotal because none of this data has been analyzed yet, but it was an El Nino year this year, and we saw a pretty significant decrease in red-footed booby nesting. So it'll be really interesting to have this data to look back on so we can kind of understand what happened and why the red-footed booby nesting kind of dropped off during that time.
So we have a quick question. If you go back to that slide,
Sure.
the question is, when do the booby chicks lose their fluffy feathers?
So the booby chicks lose their fluffy feathers after about a month. It takes them 45 days to fledge, and so they remain very fluffy for the first few days and weeks of their life. And then once they develop their adult plumage, they're ready to fledge the nest. But they're really cute when they're babies, as you can see up here in the right-hand corner. That's a red-footed booby chick. Yeah. Any other questions?
Not yet.
Okay, great. So the last project that I want to talk about that I was able to be involved in was the Seahawk Conservation Introduction Project. So the Seahawk, or the Guam kingfisher, is an endemic bird to Guam, but it has been driven to extinction in the wild by the introduced brown tree snake. And then in the 80s, the last few seahecks were taken out of the wild and put into captivity, where a captive breeding program was started. And I think it was less than 50 individuals at the time, but there are now up to 145 individuals remaining in captivity. But unfortunately, population viability analyses are projecting that the Seahawk might start experiencing some inbreeding depression soon, and so it can't persist indefinitely in the wild, or sorry, in captivity. But the problem is there are still brown tree snakes in Guam. So in the meantime, Palmyra has been identified as a intermediary introduction site because of the similar climate, the lack of predators, and the abundance of prey species. And the end goal here is to establish a small experimental population on Palmyra in order to monitor the birds and see how they fare in the wild after being in captivity for over 30 years. And the end goal of this project is to establish a population of them in Guam once the tree snakes are eradicated. So my involvement with this project was I undertook the first few rounds of environmental monitoring, and basically this is where my bird-friendly maple time really came in. It was basically counting and identifying bugs, and we had 30 plots all around the atoll with 5 arboreal cover boards and 5 ground cover boards. And this is kind of a picture of them in the bottom here. It's just roofing material or insulation material that we wrapped around the tree and put on the ground. And the closed space encourages the critters to come and hang out. And then we just lift it up and count and ID everything that's in there. And the reason we're doing that is to develop a baseline estimate of prey abundance. And this type of monitoring is going to continue while the birds are released and after they're released on Palmyra, which is expected to be in June of this year. Um, and that's for 2 reasons. So first, we're not entirely sure what the sea heck are going to be eating on Palmyra. It's expected that they're going to go after the geckos primarily, but we're not positive. So the environmental monitoring will provide some insight into that. And then also having that pre and post introduction data sets will help us understand if there are any effects on the prey communities from the release of this bird.
We do have a question related to these birds, and it is how is the introduction of the how do you pronounce the bird? Sea hex?
Sea heck, yeah.
How is the introduction of the sea hex expected to help with the inbreeding problems if there are no new individuals?
That's a good question. It is my understanding that it's not intended to address the inbreeding depression issue. It's more that they are feeling like the bird needs to be put back into the wild, and they want to make sure that before it's introduced to Guam, that it is still able to survive in the wild since it's been in captivity for 30 years. So I don't think the introduction project is meant to address the inbreeding depression problem, although it might if they have. So the sea heck are in zoos all over the US and the world. So there might be like they choose very specifically which individuals to introduce to each other to nest and to mate. And they do that very deliberately based on the genetic makeup of each bird. So I think they're trying to like reduce the amount of inbreeding depression risk with that careful selection. And then develop this experimental population so that they can see if the bird is able to survive in the wild.
We have one little question that I've been waiting. It's back to the boobies. How many species of boobies are there on Palmyra?
There are 3 species of boobies on Palmyra. There's the red-footed booby, which is the most abundant, and then there's brown boobies and masked boobies as well. Brown and masked boobies are both ground nesters, so the red-footed boobies are the only ones that prefer to nest in the trees.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, well, that was kind of the gist of my regular recurring bird work, but I did want to just highlight a couple of other cool projects that I was able to get involved in. One of the coolest research or coral research projects that I was able to be involved in was the Reef Soundscape project, where scientists are trying to understand what the difference in soundscape or like the audio makeup of a healthy versus a degraded reef sounds like. And the role that the science volunteers plays in that is that we actually go and deploy and pick up their underwater audio recording devices for them. Another really awesome project that's happening on Palmyra is the DFAD Watch program. This was, well, I guess I'll explain what a DFAD is first. DFADs, for those who don't know, are drifting fish aggregating devices, and they are used by the fishing industry because they consist of a raft and a float underneath, and that encourages the fish to like aggregate around it. And then they have a satellite buoy on them as well, so the fish, or sorry, not the fish, the fishermen know where the fish are and they can go scoop them up. But the problem with these are that they are just drifting in the ocean untethered. And so they often end up washing up on reefs. And that tail is often weighted and it just drags through the coral and just destroys everything in its path. So our pelagic conservation strategy lead, Kid Pollock, he has developed a relationship with several US fisheries and they actually share the location of their fads with him. And so he gets alerted when they come within 6 miles of the atoll and we hop on our offshore vessel and we go pull them out of the water before they can reach the reef. I also was able to help out with BRUV's research, which that stands for Baited Remote Underwater Video Stations. And that also kind of explains what they are. They are these stations with fish bait and video cameras, and we drop them in the ocean. And the goal there is to understand food webs and species interactions in deep pelagic water ecosystems where we don't really like know that much about them. So we went 20 miles offshore and we dropped these stations in the water and drift for an hour and then repeated a bunch of times. And then we have all this video footage of what's happening in deep water out in the middle of the ocean. Another project that I was able to be involved in was the seabird facilitated foraging study. I helped tag red-footed boobies with accelerometers and GPS trackers, and then we tracked well, not me. The researchers tracked the boobies' movements out while they're foraging out on the open ocean and created a track. And that's kind of trying to understand how seabirds um, affect how deep water predators affect booby foraging. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the this was an El Nino year, and the coral reef around Palmyra got hit very hard. It experienced a lot of bleaching, which I got to watch firsthand and was quite sad. But it was also a great opportunity to do some science on coral bleaching events. So we helped several different partner organizations do different degrees of monitoring for coral bleaching. Um, and I don't want to go into too much detail because I want to make sure there's time for questions, but I'm happy to talk about these in a little more detail if anyone is curious.
Well, we might be able to do that. We do have one question, and
Sure.
it was, what was your favorite project and why?
Ooh, that's a really tough one.
And I
I
think
think-
it's somebody who's related to you, by the way.
Oh. Um, I think my favorite projects were the ones that were underwater. I love birds. However, I have never had to like snorkel or swim or be underwater for work before, and that was just like really fun and really unique. And I've actually never snorkeled before I went to Palmyra or like as an adult at least. And so it was really cool to have this opportunity to learn how to do something and then like apply it to conservation. It was really fun. And it's also just really awesome when like there's a bunch of reef sharks like watching you do your work. Like that's pretty unique.
That sounds fabulous. We have no more questions at the moment, but my experience is that as we are winding down your presentation, there may be some more. So feel free to tell us a little bit more about something.
Okay. Yeah, well, I guess I'll go into a little more detail maybe about the bleaching monitoring that I was able to do because that's pretty interesting. So what happened with the bleaching event was it started around October. Um, and El Nino causes the surface waters of the ocean to get much warmer. And so a lot of the coral respond to that by becoming bleached. And a lot of people think that bleaching means death for coral, but it actually does not. So coral is a symbiotic organism. It's the coral itself and then the coral polyps themselves, and they have a symbiotic algae, which gives them their color. And when they experience stress, they dispel their algae. But the coral polyps are heterotrophic and they're actually able to survive as long as there's adequate food around them to like go out and reach with their little mouths. So we were monitoring these specific coral colonies that had been sampled and undergone a coral bleaching experiment in a lab. I think it was the Stanford lab that was spearheading this project. So they had actually tested these coral in a lab environment to see how they would respond to heat stress. And then a few months later, this happened in the summer of 2023, we had an actual heat stress event in nature. So me and my partner went out and we took photographs of these specific coral colonies that the researchers had studied in the lab. And we were able to photograph them over time and see how they were actually responding in a real life heat stress situation. And a lot of them were still alive, which was pretty inspiring and awesome to see. Um, and then the upwelling research that was happening, that was also related to El Nino and the coral bleaching. So one of the mechanisms that allows coral to survive when they're bleached is upwelling. Upwelling is when cold water from the deeper parts of the ocean come up to the reef, and cold water has more like nutrients in it, so they bring nutrients to the reef, and then that allows the reef to subside off of those nutrients during bleaching events. But without upwelling, what happens during El Nino is that the surface waters become so warm that the ocean gets so stratified that upwelling can't happen. So when upwelling doesn't happen, then the coral are not able to have that food source delivered to them. And so the heterotrophic coral polyps that have already expelled their algae will die without adequate food. So we were collecting this algae called Halimeda, which the researchers were using as kind of a conduit of studying upwelling because it's a single-celled organism. Basically, it's like a chain of little algae circle things, and each circle is a single cell. So they're very readily able to like dehydrate it and look at the like anatomical makeup, and they can actually detect how much upwelling has occurred based on how much nitrogen is in those Halimeda cells. So during the El Nino and the bleaching event, we collected Halimeda every month. And none of it's been analyzed yet, unfortunately, so I don't have any results to share with you. But basically, with that analysis, they'll be able to see exactly when or if upwelling started, and then connect that with the coral responses to see how that affected their ability to survive.
Well, as predicted, Claire, we are having questions pop up left and right. So here we go. But I would like to remind everybody that if you've enjoyed our Zoom program series this year, please consider a donation. And at the top of your chat, there is a link to our donation, or you can simply go to our Green Mountain website. So here we go. We have a question. How did your work with maple forest integrate with your work on the atoll? Good luck.
Actually, I was thinking about this when I was developing the PARP section of the project. So I was noticing a parallel between how, and this isn't the Maple Project specific, but just kind of like connecting my experience here in New England to my experience out on Palmyra, how white-tailed deer overpopulation in northern forests kind of had a similar effect of the rats on Palmyra, where they just decimate the understory, and that makes the forest a lot more susceptible to invasive species. And it was just interesting that kind of like a totally different organism had the same effect out on Palmyra. But I would say that the the most direct way that my maple project work affected my work on Palmyra was just developing the skill of like identifying bugs. I didn't know that that would be applicable to future jobs, but knowing the arthropod orders was really, really handy when I was doing the environmental monitoring for the Sea project.
Would you like to share with our listeners that big spider? Tell us about the one, and tell them where the spiders hide.
Oh
Terrifying.
my. Yeah, so one of the two most abundant arthropods on Palmyra, they're both invasive, but it's cockroaches and it's huntsman spiders. And I didn't share the graph with you all that we made after environmental monitoring, but cockroaches were the most abundant arthropod on Palmyra by a landslide. There are just like hundreds of them, and often when we would take the cover boards off the trees, like 50 to 100 cockroaches would scuttle away. It was quite foul. But the huntsman spiders, honestly, I prefer those to the cockroaches. They get very big. They can get as big as your hand, but they're very
Mm.
docile, and they're very skittish, and they like to hide in cracks and crevices. And so you might put on your shoe or put on your rain jacket, and there might be one hanging out in there, and take you by surprise. But they're
Okay,
very
that's enough.
harmless. They're
That's
not.
enough of that. Let's go to a scientific question. And I'm not even sure I can read this question, but I'm going to give it a go. Did you see red-footed booby incubation counts from MICs or just anecdotal observation? Did you see those counts start to increase and rebound toward the end of your term as the water cooled down?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, the answer is no, but that's because there's kind of a lag period, and this has been observed with the data from past MIC counts. But when there's like some type of heat stress event or other event that impacts the booby nesting, it usually takes a few weeks to a few months for the birds to be able to rebound from it. So I think it would be too early for me to start seeing them recover and start laying eggs just while I was there. But hopefully they will start to nest a little more back at their normal rates after they've had a few weeks to kind of recuperate from the food shortage that resulted from the El Nino.
Next question. Given your experience in the environmental sciences, are you optimistic that your generation can make a positive difference regarding the future of the natural world?
Oh wow. Um, I want to say yes. Like personally, I felt so inspired by all the work that was happening on Palmyra and just inspired by people in my generation in general. Like I feel like we are having so much um care and attention for these problems and willingness to address it too. And I just feel like conservation and environmental issues are gaining a lot of momentum. And I think people are stepping up and doing what it takes to address those problems. So I'm personally optimistic. And I think it's much better to be optimistic about it than not because we've only got this one planet, so it's we can't give up on it, you know?
That would have been a perfect close, but unfortunately, we have two specific questions. And the next one is not a good segue. Did you observe any plastic garbage and debris in the water around the atoll?
Oh my gosh, yes. I'm so glad you brought this up. I don't want to bum anyone out, but there was so much plastic all over Palmyra. Like so much to the point where we actually, while I was there, developed a new program where we're collecting the trash and sending it back to Hawaii to be analyzed where it's coming from. Because we would do weekly beach cleanups and immediately, almost immediately, there would just be more washing up. There was plastic on every inch of the atoll. Like, I don't think there was a single island that I went to that I didn't see plastic bottles all over the place. Um, so that's quite upsetting. And unfortunately, there was really nothing we could do about it because on Palmyra we burned all of our waste. So it would have just been like a massive amount of emissions if we collected all of that plastic and burned it. So we just have to leave it. And it's very sad that such an like untouched corner of the world is still experiencing the effects of single-use plastic. But
The last little question we have as we're winding down is you've already answered it, but I feel obliged to ask it. Have the rats been eradicated as of now?
yes, the rats were eradicated in 2011 and have stayed eradicated since.
Well, I am going to ask that all of our viewers applaud your efforts and your generation's efforts. Claire, this was a fabulous presentation. Very interesting. One person just wrote, very interesting presentation. Your enthusiasm for conservation is evident. Keep up the good work. Psst, it was your mom. Okay.
Thanks, Mom.
Everybody, thank you so much. We have one more program coming up, and that is our perennial favorite, Zach Coda, who will be ending our series this year talking about rare birds in Vermont that have visited in the past and what we may be looking forward to. So, as the booby flies, Claire, I would like you to tell our, because I think it's fascinating, tell us about your plans and your return to the coast up here in New England, please.
Sure, yeah. So this summer, I am going to be working with Mass Audubon's Coastal Waterbird program. I'm going to be assisting with nest tagging and monitoring for the endangered piping plover, American oystercatcher, and least tern down in Massachusetts. So super excited to kind of return to my Eastern Coast roots. Even though my stint on the tropics was very fun, I'm really looking forward to just giving back to the ecosystem and the community that got me started in conservation in the first place.
Well, we loved seeing all of your work on Palmyra, and we wish you all the best as you return, like the nesting birds, to the Cape and help out and do the count. So, again, thank you very much, Claire. And we thank all of those of you who participated tonight and attended this fabulous presentation, which is recorded, and give us a couple of days. And if anybody else would like to see it or see it again, it will be up on our website. So everybody stay safe, stay warm, have some soup, watch the snow melt. And Claire, you are already on my list for a presenter next year. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, Claire.